So I think we're ready to go. Our next speaker is Danielle Cox from Mount St. Vincent University, who will speak on a sequence arising from diffusion in graphs. Please.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So there have been several talks during the week that involved graph theory. So I am a kind of a graph theorist by nature. This talk is a little tangential to some of the other graph theory talks that we've seen, but hopefully you find it a little interesting. And this is my first time attending CANT, and I can tell you it won't be my last. This has been a really enjoyable week. So thanks for organizing this with so many speakers. I'm sure this wasn't a small feat. All right, so this is work done with some co-authors of mine, Richard Nowakowski, who's a professor emeritus at Dalhousie University. That's also in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Todd Mullen. Richard and I were Todd's PhD supervisors. And this is some work that we had done during Todd's graduate studies. And Todd right now is at the University of Saskatchewan. And I think Mel had been asking, and just so in case others aren't quite sure where Halifax, Nova Scotia is and where the Mount is, we're not too far from New York. We're an hour earlier, but we're just a short little flight or a couple days drive away. And here's just some pictures. I like to brag about Nova Scotia because I think it's beautiful. So there's our beautiful Halifax Harbor with our citadel. And my claim to fame is that my grandfather was the Halifax town crier. So I spent a lot of time up on the citadel there with him. And this is our campus, Mount St. Vincent. We're a pretty small university, about 5,000 students, undergrad and graduate. And we're right here on the water. And there's our lovely science building where the mathematicians live. So I'm going to talk about diffusion, and this is a process that is defined and played on a finite simple graph. And we've had other talks about graphs during the week. So there's an example of a nice finite simple graph. And this problem was introduced by Chris Duffy and Margaret Ellen Messenger and Richard Nowakowski and Margaret Ellen's student Finn Lidbetter. So they're all out here on the east coast of Canada. And this was put on archive in 2016 and published in 2018. And diffusion is a discrete time process. So as time goes on, things are happening in the graph, and I'll describe what those things are in a moment. But it is a variation on a discrete time process called chip firing. So maybe some of you have heard of this before, maybe not, doesn't matter. I'm going to explain the process from scratch. I'm assuming no background. So in diffusion, we're playing on a finite simple graph. And what we do is we're going to take each vertex and we're going to assign it a number of chips. So in the graph we have here on the slide, I'm going to give each vertex a number, and that represents the number of chips that vertex has. And we call this assignment of these integer values to the vertices a configuration. And then what happens is at each time step, because I said this is a discrete time process, time goes on, something's going to happen. The vertices are all going to fire simultaneously. And so what that means is that each vertex will send a chip to a neighbor who is poorer than them. So this is where the name diffusion comes from, right? We can think about it as something diffusing, it goes from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So that's what's happening in this graph. So for example, I have the arrows here to show you how the chips will diffuse at this time step. This vertex here with 5 chips will be sending a chip to every single one of the other ones, its neighbors, because they're poor. And this vertex here, save degree, has 4 chips. It'll send one to the 2 of its neighbors because they are poor, and it will receive one of the chips from its neighbor with 5 because that one's richer. So it'll send one to them. So these vertices will fire. And then what happens is we end up with a new configuration. I will note it is possible that a vertex will go into debt. Suppose a vertex has 1 chip and all of its neighbors, it maybe has 10 neighbors and they all have 0 chips. It will send a chip and go into debt. So we could get negative chip values. So this is the diffusion process. So maybe we'll work through this example. So at time 0, we have our initial configuration. The vertices fire, we get a new configuration. They fire, we get a new configuration, and it keeps going on until something interesting happens. We can see here at time step 5 that we have reached a configuration we have already seen. So we would say that we are in the period. That is, we are revisiting a configuration we've already seen. So T3 and T5, we have the same configurations happening. So we are now in the period. We would say that the period for this graph and the initial configuration we gave it is length 2, because we have two configurations. This one that's like 5, 3, 2, 4, 2, 4, and the orange one 0, 4, 5, 3, 5, 3. Those two are just going to alternate indefinitely as time goes on in this diffusion process. So this graph has a period of length 2. We could also say that the pre-period for this graph and the configuration it started with is length 3, because there's 3 configurations that appear before we enter that period. In this talk, we're just interested in periods, so that's what we're going to be focusing on. And in fact, we're going to be looking at complete graphs. And I know I saw some complete bipartite graphs showing up in some of the earlier talks. A complete graph is just a graph where every pair of vertices they have an edge. And we usually denote complete graphs by case of n, and n representing the number of vertices in the graph. So we're going to look at diffusion on complete graphs. So I really like examples. I am a person who likes lots of examples. So I'm going to do a couple of examples of this on complete graphs, and then we'll kind of go into some of the results that we have. So here's a configuration. All the vertices are starting with a different stack size. We have 0, 1, 2, 3, 5. Time goes on. The vertices fire. We get a new configuration. Things are diffusing. And we can see that we get a period, and the period is the length 2. If we start with a different configuration, say 0, 1, 1, 5, 5, the diffusion process begins, we fire, new configuration, fire, new configuration. Again, we enter a period, and we can see that the period again is length 2. Maybe our graph has a little bit of a boring configuration. Every vertex has the same stack size. This would have a period of length 1, right? Vertices fire, but nothing happens because all the stack sizes are equal. So nobody's sending or receiving any chips. So all the examples we saw, including the first one, all had period 1 or 2. And although that's a very small sample, you might think, is that always the case? And the answer is yes. So it was conjectured that diffusion always had period 1 or 2. And in fact, that was proven that it was the case in 2017. And then some other work done on the diffusion process. Carlotti and Herman in 2018 looked at what does the configuration have to start with in terms of stack sizes to ensure we don't go into debt, because I said a vertex could go negative, and they determined sort of what that critical value was. And then our PhD student Todd had looked at configurations that exist within the periods of different families of graphs and enumerating them. And that's the result that we're going to highlight today. So we're going to call a configuration that appears in a period of a graph as a period configuration. So in our work, we're going to study period configurations of complete graphs. So the three examples that we had looked at on complete graphs, the first example we looked at had a period of length 2, and here are the 2 configurations that appeared inside that period. Our other example had a period of 2. There's the 2 configurations that appeared within that period. And our last example only had a period of length 1, and there's the configuration that appeared within that period. So you want to know, say, if I have a K5, a complete graph from 5 vertices, no matter what I start with for a configuration, how many different configurations can appear within the period? And of course, your first thought would be, well, Danielle, there's an infinite number, right? I could start with any standard stack size that's consistent on all the vertices, right? 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, and then I'd have an infinite number. So we need to kind of think about the idea of when are 2 configurations going to be equivalent. And 2 configurations will be equivalent if they differ by the addition of a scalar. So it was been proven, adding a scalar constant to all the stack sizes doesn't change the behavior of the diffusion process. So for example, here's 2 graphs. We have a configuration on our complete graph of 5 vertices there of 4, 2, 2, 2, 2. We enter the period right away. The period is length 2. If I add 2 to all those stack sizes to get 6, 4, 4, 4, 4 for my starting configuration, nothing changes. I enter the period at the same time. It's still period of length 2. Everything is just scaled up by that constant. So we would consider those, these 2 configurations that appear in this period, we would consider these equivalent to these 2 over here. Whereas if I looked at, say, 0, 10, 10, 10, 10 as my starting configuration on that K5, it's of the same form of the others. 4 vertices have the same stack size and one's different, but they're not scalar. They don't differ by the addition of a scalar. And you can see the diffusion process is very different for this graph. We have a pre-period of length 2, and then when we enter the period is only length 1. So it's not just sort of like the form of the configuration. The actual stack sizes and whether they differ by the addition of a scalar is what's going to tell us whether they're equivalent. So the question that Richard, Todd, and I wanted to ask and answer was how many period configurations exist on unlabeled complete graphs on n vertices. And we can think about things being unlabeled because the complete graph, all the vertices you can map to one another. There's lots of automorphisms within the graph. So each vertex is essentially the same. So we can kind of start scaling things. I'm just going to start at labeling stack sizes of 0. That's where we decided to start. So if n equals 1, there's only really one period configuration, right? You can think of it as the one with size 0 or any constant. For n equals 2, so for K2, there's only 2 period configurations. Either when we enter the period, the stack sizes are the same, or they differ by 1, and that one chip will just kind of go back and forth between the 2 vertices to get that period 2. Maybe not as obvious, but if you play with it, you can see that for complete graphs on 3 vertices, there are 6 different configurations that will appear in any period. And again, of course, we can always scale these up by adding or subtracting a scalar, but here's kind of a sample of what those 6 configurations that exist within the period look like. So we wanted to count these. So we're starting to develop this sequence. We did a few more kind of by hand, and we wrote some code and kind of pushed it as far as we could to get up to K5. And we saw there are 61 period configurations. And so we wanted to know what can we say about this sequence? How does it grow? What's its growth rate? Is it a known sequence? Maybe there's something out there that's going to help us count what we want to count. So anytime I have a sequence, I toss it in good old OEIS. So that's what we did. And lo and behold, something did pop up. We had a match for the first 5, and it was board pile polyominoes in n cells and how many of them exist. So we thought, well, I didn't know much about board pile polyominoes. I'm a retro gamer, so I knew a lot about Tetris, so polyominoes. Everybody down. But yeah, we didn't really know too much, so we kind of had to explore what polyominoes were and then see whether there actually is a connection between these and what we're trying to count with these period configurations. We're going to use some terminology from D. Klarner's Fibonacci quarterly paper from back in 1965. He looked at some work on polyominoes, and we just took some of that terminology. So a polyomino is just a plain figure on n cells, and they're just unit squares that are joined edge on edge. We usually call these n-ominoes. So there's 2 examples on the slide there of 6 ominoes. And you can think of a polyomino as being sort of made of these horizontal strips. So we're going to call a kind of horizontal strip of rectangle or square, that rectangle, the max height 1, since they're unit squares. We're just going to call that an H strip. And a board pile polyomino, you can think of it as a polyomino where each row contains at most 1 H strip. And if it has n units, we're going to call it a board pile n-omino. So for the 2 examples I had of the 6 ominoes, this would be a board pile polyomino, right? Each row has just 1 H strip. This is not a board pile polyomino. Since this second row here, we have 2 H strips. So we're looking at things like this, not like this. And looking up in the literature, these have a lot of different terms. So you may have heard them called fixed polyominoes or row convex n-ominoes or lattice animals. But really they're fixed in the plane. If you rotate and reflect, those are distinct. So here's all the board pile polyominoes on 3 squares. So we have the vertical, which you can rotate to get the horizontal one. And you've got the L shape, which you can keep rotating or reflecting to get the other 4. So these are what board pile polyominoes were. And so our question then was, okay, we now know what they are. Is there a relationship between these board pile polyominoes on n cells and the period configurations of these complete graphs and n vertices that we're really interested in? OEIS suggests possibly, so we had to explore that a little bit. And so to do that, we had to come up with some notation and some mappings, which I'll kind of highlight. So yes, they are related. So to come up with some notations that we could play with these board pile polyominoes and try to map them to the things that we're looking at, we considered kind of placing the board pile polyomino on a grid, like we have here on the slide. And then we decided we're calling each row, so each one of these 8 strips, we're just going to call them S1, S2, up to S capital N, and N is just the height of that polyomino. We're going to let D sub I represent, and this is a little awkward, but I'll do an example. It's going to represent the difference between the greatest X coordinate in a strip, subtract the least X coordinate in the strip below it. And we're going to set D1 to be 0 by convention. So for example, for the polyomino that we have here, the board pile polyomino, D1 is 0 by convention. D2 will be the X coordinate, the largest one for the strip above, here, which is 3, subtract the smallest X coordinate in the strip below, which is 0. So 3 take away 0 is 3. For D3, here's our H strip. We just have the 1. Its largest X coordinate is 2. The smallest X coordinate in the strip below is 0. 2 take away 0 is 2. So D3 would be 2. And then we're going to denote a polyomino. Say I call it X. We're going to denote that as this list of kind of ordered pairs where the first entry represents that D sub I, and the second entry tells me how many squares are actually in that horizontal strip or in that row. So if I wanted to write what we would be using to express this polyomino, I would write it as 0, 2, 3, 3, because D2 is 3, and the second row here has 3 unit squares. And then the last one, D3 is 2, so that entry would be 2, and it consists of only 1 unit square, so a 1. So that's how we're going to take sort of this pictorial and kind of write it in a nice mathematical way so we can maybe play with it. And we can go backwards, and just so we can look at an example. If this is my board pile polyomino and I want to draw what that looks like, I've got D1 is 0 by default. We only have 1 square, so there's that 1 square, that's starting base for my polyomino. The next one says that the difference between the largest X coordinate in my next strip, take away the least X coordinate in the strip below, is 1. This is a 0, so this means the largest X coordinate has to be a 1. So I'm going to put my square here. But it also tells me I have 2 squares in that strip. And I can't put it on the other side, or else then my largest X coordinate is 2. And 2 take away 0 is not 1. So toss it on the other side. So that would represent that board pile polyomino. So we have some notation that we can kind of move back and forth between the pictorial and a nice sort of mathematical way of expressing it. So we wanted to find a connection between these board pile polyominoes and our complete graph configurations that exist within periods. So let's find some notation for these configurations. So what we're going to do is, if I have my complete graph and I've got a configuration, I'll call it C. We're going to represent it by a set of cardinality capital N. And capital N is just the number of distinct stack sizes in our configuration. And each element of this set is going to represent not only a stack size, but also how many vertices have that stack size. And we're going to let A to the power of K, or the superscript K, represent that the configuration has K vertices with a stack size of A. So if I want to write down the configuration for this complete graph, it's going to be 0, 1 to the superscript of 2 to represent that I have 2 vertices with a stack size of 1. And then the 5 to the superscript of 2, so that represents I have 2 vertices with a stack size of 5. So that's how we can write down that configuration. And it's a set because the order doesn't matter because it's a complete graph. Everyone's adjacent. So now what I need to do is try to map these things together. So I'm going to let B sub n be the set of all board pile polyominoes on n cells, and P sub n represent all the period configurations of our complete graph on n vertices. And we're going to define a mapping. So we'll take our polyomino in the new notation we have, and I'm going to map it to a configuration of our complete graph and one of the configurations that exist within a period of our complete graph. And how we're going to do that is, maybe this looks a little messy on the slide, but I'll go through this map. So here's our polyomino. And so the first one is going to be d sub 1, which is 0 to the size of S1. So the number of things, number of squares, unit squares in that first strip. And then we're going to map to, for every other one, it's going to be the sum of the di's that came before it to the power of the number of things in that strip. And I realize I'm kind of not being super clear here. So what happens is the configuration we're mapping to, we're going to look at the sums of the previous di's. That's going to be our stack size. And the size of the H strips will correspond to how many vertices have that given stack size. So here we end up with a configuration. We've got capital N entries because we have capital N different possible stack sizes. And when we add the S1, S2, S3 up to S capital N, that does equal N, the number of vertices in our complete graph. So this should all work out nicely. And it does. I won't go through the details, but here's a bit of an example. Here's a polyomino. And of course, I don't have a starting right at 0, 0, but I, of course, could have shifted that over. I can translate them in the plane, and that doesn't change things. So here's our board pile polyomino, and here's our notation for it. This has 10 unit cells, so this would map to a complete graph on 10 vertices. And the stack sizes, I'd have 2 of size 0, and then I do 3 plus 0 is 3 to the superscript of 2 to represent that I'm going to have 2 vertices of stack size 3. The 2 plus 3 plus 0 is 5, all raised to the power of 4 represents the fact that I'm going to have 4 vertices with a stack size of 5. And lastly, the 3 plus 2 plus 3 plus 0 is 8, raised to that power of 2 tells me I'm going to have the last 2 vertices will have a stack size of 8. So that polyomino will map to that configuration of our complete graph. We can show this mapping as a bijection. Well, we can show that in fact, the thing we map to, that configuration, is indeed a period configuration, just like we want. And that for any period configuration, there is some polyomino that's going to map to it. And if I have 2 different polyominoes, they do indeed map to 2 different configurations. So we got this nice one-to-one correspondence. So this tells me that if I want to count my stuff, I just need to know about the polyominoes. And the fact that diffusion is always period 1 or period 2 played into making kind of this proof all work. So if I have 2 configurations existing in the period, when they bounce back and forth, the polyomino is just doing a horizontal flip there. So there's some nice things that are happening. So now we can answer question 1. How many period configurations exist on n vertices? It's just the number of board pile polyominoes. And there's a lot known about that. Again, from that paper by David Klarner, we have a nice recursion to compute them. We know sort of the growth rate about triples. As n increases by 1, the number of configurations roughly triple. So we know a little bit about how this sequence that we were interested in behaves. And it was nice that we could connect it to something a little unknown. It was a little surprising. I like it when math turns out like that. In terms of open problems, you could look at configurations for other families of graphs. What can we say about them? How many exist within their period? Pre-periods haven't been looked at all. So if we want to look at sort of how many pre-periods can exist and these sequences that can arise, what can we say about them? How do we compute them? What are their growth rates? So there's lots of questions out there. And I just want to thank you for letting me speak at the conference.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Danielle? If not, then I thank Danielle again for a very nice talk.